Today, on August 11th, the atmosphere carries a pressure that is difficult to explain through ordinary logic. Because Eclipse Week is beginning to move through your life with an ancient force that can rearrange circumstances before you even understand why they are changing. If you have recently noticed an unusual heaviness in your body, difficulty settling your thoughts, disrupted sleep, emotional restlessness, or a quiet inner sense that something is approaching, pay attention to that feeling. You may have been sensing the movement before you could name it. The coming eclipse does not depend on whether you feel prepared for what it brings, and that is precisely why this period can feel so intense. Fate rarely announces its arrival in a convenient form. It often enters through a subtle disturbance, an uncomfortable realization, a conversation that suddenly carries a different meaning, or an emotion that appears without an obvious explanation. Eclipse Week works through that kind of pressure. It begins creating movement before the exact moment arrives, gradually loosening structures that have become too rigid for the person you are becoming. What you experience now may therefore feel confusing, but confusion does not necessarily mean that you are lost. Sometimes confusion is the first stage of seeing something differently. The walls surrounding an old version of your life can begin weakening long before the visible change takes place, giving you time to recognize what has been holding you in place. That is why the energy around August 11th can feel personal, almost as though something beyond ordinary circumstances is asking you to look inward. What is happening is not simply about an event in the sky. It is about the internal response that event awakens inside you. And this is where the real test begins. It is not an academic examination, and there is no page you can fill out correctly. The challenge is written into the deepest parts of your experience, into the fears you rarely admit, the doubts you carry quietly, the habits you repeat even after they stop serving you, and the parts of yourself you have learned to suppress in order to remain accepted. August 11th becomes the point around which that challenge is organized, influenced by forces that existed long before your current fears and uncertainties. Before you move deeper into this eclipse passage, there is one principle you need to understand clearly. Awakening and abundance are not opposing paths. They belong to the same process. When your awareness expands, the way you think about possibility, security, money, worth, and your own ability to receive can change with it. Your mind is not supposed to become an obstacle that constantly argues against your potential. It is supposed to become a tool that helps you recognize and work with it. This is why Train Your Brain to Make More Money, the audiobook now available for you, is being placed into this conversation. It was created to help you address the internal patterns that can stand between your present circumstances and the wealth you have been preparing yourself to receive. As this eclipse removes outdated patterns from your life, you can also examine the scarcity thinking that has quietly shaped your choices. Instead of automatically expecting limitation, you can begin developing a mental orientation that is more compatible with abundance. The link is waiting in the description and is also pinned at the top of the comments. Consider it alongside everything else you are learning during this period, because the thoughts you repeatedly nourish do not remain confined to your imagination. Over time, they influence the choices you make, the opportunities you recognize, the risks you avoid, and the possibilities you allow yourself to believe are available to you. Yet the deeper issue remains, the test connected with August 11th. The significance of this date is not simply that another day has arrived. It represents a moment when the pressure of the eclipse period can make certain truths much harder to ignore. Every day carries its own atmosphere, but not every day produces the same sense of consequence. This is why August 11th can feel like a moment of evaluation, as though life itself is placing a question in front of you and asking whether you are prepared to step beyond the identity that fear has constructed. The question is not whether you have been perfect. The question is whether you are willing to move toward the person you have always been capable of becoming, or whether you will retreat into the smaller identity that has felt safer because it is familiar. That is the heart of the test. It is not designed to punish you. It is an initiation into greater self-recognition. The eclipse energy gathering around August 11th acts like a filter, making it easier to distinguish what has genuine substance from what has been maintained only through habit, convenience, fear, or illusion. Consider the relationships in your life that continue because they are familiar rather than truthful. Consider the work that consumes your energy while leaving your deeper sense of purpose unfed. Consider the opinions you hold about yourself that may have originated in somebody else's experience rather than your own reality. Some of those beliefs may have been inherited from other people's fears, other people's disappointments, and other people's limitations. You may have carried them for so long that they began to sound like your own thoughts. Eclipse energy brings attention to those hidden agreements. It creates circumstances in which you may finally notice what you previously tolerated without questioning. An eclipse does not function like an ordinary source of illumination. Its symbolism is different. Instead of simply making everything brighter, it can create conditions in which concealed material becomes impossible to overlook. The shadow becomes part of the revelation. What has been operating quietly in the background can move into your awareness, and that can be uncomfortable because some truths are not difficult to understand once you see them. They are difficult because accepting them requires you to change. Perhaps your intuition has already been trying to tell you something during the quietest hours of your day. Perhaps you have repeatedly felt that a certain situation no longer matches who you are. Perhaps you have been avoiding a realization because acknowledging it would require a decision. This is why fear can rise as August 11th approaches. A part of you may already understand what this period is asking you to confront. But you are not required to meet that confrontation as a frightened person. You can meet it as someone becoming more conscious of their own power. Eclipses are not merely random points scattered across the calendar. Ancient civilizations treated these celestial events with extraordinary seriousness. They observed them, predicted them, worshipped them, feared them, and constructed sacred places around their movements because they recognized that unusual changes in the sky could carry profound symbolic meaning. Across those traditions, eclipses became associated with thresholds, transitions, and moments when the boundary between an established reality and an emerging reality seemed unusually thin. That is why Eclipse Week should not be understood as one isolated day. It is a passage of time, a corridor leading toward the exact eclipse and extending beyond it, during which unresolved material can become increasingly difficult to avoid. During this corridor, you may notice old emotional wounds returning to the surface. Someone from your past may unexpectedly appear again. An ending may occur before you have decided that you are ready for it. A beginning may emerge before you have had time to make sense of what came before. These experiences can feel chaotic when viewed separately, but within the symbolic language of eclipse energy, they represent the clearing of space. Something new cannot fully occupy a place that remains completely filled by what has already ended. The process can therefore feel forceful, because it is asking you to release what you have continued carrying long after its purpose has been completed. Eclipse Week can change the direction of your life, but the meaning is not that the universe is acting against you. The deeper message is precision. The timing may not match your preferred schedule, but the movement arrives when the circumstances are ready to expose what needs to change. You may not yet recognize yourself as strong enough for that shift, but the experience itself can reveal capacities you have spent years overlooking. Look carefully at what is happening around you now, because the test does not necessarily announce itself through dramatic external events. It often begins through small irritations that become increasingly difficult to dismiss. A conversation that once seemed normal may suddenly feel exhausting. A routine you once accepted may begin to feel restrictive. Someone you have known for a long time may suddenly seem unfamiliar, not because they have necessarily changed overnight, but because your perception of the relationship has changed. These moments can function like diagnostic signals. They draw your attention toward areas of life where the foundation may not be as stable as you once believed. Something beneath the surface may have been deteriorating while you were too afraid, too busy, or too emotionally invested to examine it directly. If you have been unusually sensitive or easily triggered lately, do not automatically interpret that reaction as weakness. It can indicate that an unresolved part of you is demanding recognition. When something inside you has been ignored for years, even a small external event can touch the hidden wound and produce a much larger emotional response. That response can become information. If you have recently felt an unexpected desire to leave something you once desperately wanted to keep, do not automatically assume that you are confused. Sometimes clarity arrives first as discomfort because your old conditioning is resisting a new understanding. You may have been trained to remain where you are, to accept less, to keep quiet, to avoid disappointing people, or to make yourself smaller whenever your needs became inconvenient for someone else. The eclipse period challenges that conditioning by bringing your internal truth closer to the surface. The test is not an attempt to convince the universe that you are powerful enough. Your strength does not need to be proven to something that already knows the entire history of your experience. The real purpose is for you to recognize your own strength. Many people spend years questioning themselves. They reduce their presence so other people will feel comfortable. They silence their instincts after being told that their reactions are excessive, dramatic, unrealistic, or wrong. Over time, that repeated self-suppression can become so automatic that shrinking feels like safety. Eclipse week challenges that pattern. It begins removing the layers of fear and conditioning that have covered the identity underneath them. What remains is not necessarily a completely different person. It is the part of you that has been present all along, waiting for enough awareness to stop hiding. This is why the emotional atmosphere can feel so powerful. Ancient cultures understood the symbolic magnitude of an eclipse because the heavens appeared to behave differently, and you may now recognize a similar disturbance within yourself. The internal tremor often arrives before the breakthrough. Before a new perspective becomes peaceful, it can first become disruptive. You might cry without immediately knowing the reason. You might remember grief that you believed had already been resolved. You might think about people, experiences, or relationships that you believed were fully released, only to discover that some emotional thread still remains. Do not automatically interpret that return as failure. Revisiting an old emotion does not always mean returning to an old life. Sometimes it means your awareness has finally reached a deeper layer of something you were previously unable to process. The universe, within the spiritual framework of this eclipse period, is drawing attention beneath the surface identity you have constructed for survival. Beneath obligations, fear, expectations, and the exhausting habit of telling everyone that you are fine, there may be parts of you that have been waiting to be acknowledged. That can make alignment feel far less comfortable than people imagine. Genuine internal adjustment is not always soft. It can be raw, disruptive, and deeply honest before it becomes peaceful. The emotional intensity you feel does not automatically mean that something has gone wrong. It may be part of the process through which the old structure loses its authority over you. Every profound awakening carries some form of confrontation, because you cannot fully step into a new understanding while continuously protecting the illusion that made the old identity comfortable. The crucial difference is what you do while the storm is moving through you. You can run toward familiar numbness, distraction, denial, and old patterns, or you can remain present long enough to understand what the emotional turbulence is showing you. That willingness to stay conscious inside the discomfort is where the transformation begins. And it is also where the next part of this eclipse journey will take you. Right now, in the days moving toward August 11th, you are being called into a kind of emotional honesty that you may have avoided for a very long time. And this is not the moment to numb yourself, distract yourself, or pretend that what your body and spirit are releasing does not matter. Pay attention to what rises within you, because an intensity this powerful is not without meaning. A cosmic event of this magnitude is not arranged with such precise timing, only to leave you wounded when it passes. The difficulty itself carries a hidden purpose, and within the pressure of this eclipse is a reward far greater than a temporary change in circumstances. What begins to emerge afterward can represent a fundamental redirection of your path, a deep recalibration in the way your life unfolds. The people who truly belong beside you can become easier to recognize. Opportunities that seemed invisible or unreachable can begin presenting themselves more clearly. Most importantly, the person you have privately imagined becoming can begin moving from an internal vision into something you actually experience in your daily life. That is why the emotional storm matters. The discomfort is not meaningless. You are being prepared to carry something that requires more internal space than your previous life demanded from you. You cannot enter a larger chapter while continuing to rely entirely on the emotional structure that allowed the previous chapter to exist. Something within you has to expand. Something has to mature. Something has to become strong enough to hold experiences that once would have frightened you into retreat. This preparation is not the universe deciding whether you are worthy of receiving good things. Your worth has never been the question. The deeper question is whether you can finally receive what you have wanted without immediately destroying it through old patterns. Whether you can remain open when unfamiliar opportunities appear. Whether you can resist the instinct to retreat simply because the unknown feels less safe than the limitations you already understand. This is the real preparation taking place before August 11th. The life waiting beyond this threshold may be larger than the life you have known, but reaching it requires you to move directly through the challenge instead of searching for a route around it. To understand why this moment can carry such weight, you have to look beyond the eclipse as a single event and consider how eclipse energy interacts with the larger architecture surrounding it. An eclipse does not exist as an isolated point, disconnected from everything else. It activates the celestial influences it encounters, interacts with planetary alignments, engages patterns already present in the sky, and brings attention to karmic threads that may have been developing through your life long before you understood their significance. Imagine a complicated lock that has resisted every attempt to open it, no matter how much effort you have applied. You may have spent months or even years pushing against certain closed doors, questioning your choices, questioning your worth, and wondering why your efforts seemed to produce so little movement. You may have looked at other people's progress and secretly wondered why their lives seemed to advance, while yours remained suspended in the same unresolved places. But not every closed door is waiting for more force. Some doors remain closed because the timing has not arrived. Some changes require a particular convergence before movement becomes possible. This eclipse represents the key reaching the lock at the precise moment when the mechanism is ready to turn. That is why several areas of your life may suddenly seem to accelerate, collide, shift, or unexpectedly align at the same time. The conditions surrounding this moment have been developing for much longer than you may have realized, and now they are reaching a configuration capable of releasing something that has been waiting behind the scenes. Yet transformation has a price that cannot be avoided, and that price is confrontation with what has remained unresolved inside you. Somewhere beneath the personality you show the world is a wound you may have learned to manage instead of actually healing. Perhaps abandonment has been hidden beneath an image of independence. Perhaps a deep belief that you are not worthy has been disguised as modesty. Perhaps fear of failure has been presented to yourself as practicality or realism. These strategies can become so familiar that you stop recognizing them as defenses. They begin to feel like personality traits. Eclipse week cuts through that disguise. It moves attention away from the performance and toward the source, because unresolved pain does not disappear simply because you become skilled at hiding it. If the deeper wound remains untouched, it can continue influencing your decisions, your relationships, your expectations, and even your ability to accept positive experiences when they finally arrive. This is why the confrontation can feel so uncomfortable, and also why it may be one of the most meaningful parts of the entire process. You cannot construct a stable future on top of a foundation that remains organized around old pain. The relationships you have wanted, the abundance you have hoped for, and the sense of purpose you have been seeking cannot fully settle into a life that is still being governed by wounds you refuse to acknowledge. The eclipse, therefore, brings those hidden emotions forward, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to finally loosen your grip on burdens you may have carried for years, for decades, or even since childhood. You may temporarily feel exposed, as though private emotions and hidden fears have somehow become impossible to conceal. Instead of immediately pushing them back down, allow yourself to recognize them. What remains hidden often continues to influence you from behind the scenes. Once you can see it clearly, its ability to control your choices begins to weaken. This is where another important choice appears. Some of you may feel an immediate urge to resist. You may want to hold more tightly to familiar circumstances, convince yourself that nothing needs to change, or explain away every uncomfortable feeling as an ordinary reaction to an ordinary week. Fear can become extremely convincing when it disguises itself as logic. It can tell you that staying exactly where you are is simply being sensible. It can persuade you that changing direction is reckless. It can encourage you to call emotional discomfort irrational, rather than recognizing what that discomfort is revealing. The universe does not need to force you into transformation against your will. But that does not mean the message becomes quieter simply because you refuse to hear it. When a truth is repeatedly ignored, it can return through circumstances that become increasingly difficult to dismiss. The same lesson may appear through different people, different situations, and different emotional reactions, until you finally recognize the pattern underneath them. This is why eclipse experiences can look completely different from one person to another. The process feels like a gradual loosening, a quiet inner certainty that arrives without dramatic disruption and gently redirects the course of their life. For others, the experience can feel like a sudden collapse, an abrupt ending, or several circumstances changing at once. The eclipse itself is not necessarily the difference. The amount of resistance between the person and the truth they are being asked to face can shape how turbulent the process feels. You have a choice during these coming days. You can approach the shift with openness and allow the changes to move through your life with as much cooperation as you can offer. Or you can fight every indication that something is changing and force yourself through the same transition with much greater turbulence. Either way, the message continues moving toward you. The question is not whether you can prevent transformation altogether. The more important question is how much unnecessary suffering you are willing to create by resisting what you already know deep inside. There is also a reason some people seem to rise under this kind of cosmic pressure, while others feel crushed by it. The souls who move through it with greater strength are often the ones who have already spent years being prepared in ways they did not understand at the time. If the months leading up to this moment have felt like an extended period of being stripped down, tested, humbled, or pushed beyond limits that once seemed reasonable, do not automatically interpret those experiences as evidence that you were being punished. They may have been forging capacities you would later need. The hardships that seemed pointless may have been strengthening endurance. The moments that made you question yourself may have forced you to discover what remained when familiar forms of security disappeared. The struggle itself may have been preparation hidden inside difficulty. Now the significance of that preparation can begin to become visible. You may still feel uncertain. You may still look at what is approaching and wonder whether you are actually ready. That feeling is more common than you realize. People rarely feel completely prepared immediately before stepping into a life-changing chapter. Readiness is not always something you possess before the movement begins. Often, it develops because you are willing to take the step while uncertainty is still present. You do not need to feel completely prepared. You need to be willing to move forward, despite the part of you that wants absolute guarantees. Everything you have survived until this point has contributed to the strength you may need for what is arriving now. This eclipse belongs to those who have been preparing quietly, painfully, and faithfully, sometimes without even realizing that preparation was taking place. If you recognize yourself in that experience, then the significance of this moment becomes deeply personal. The instant you choose to move through the test, instead of constantly running away from it, something begins to change in the atmosphere of your life. At first, you may barely notice. It can resemble a subtle shift in pressure, the kind of change in the air that occurs just before a storm finally breaks and the sky begins clearing. After carrying tension for so long, you may suddenly experience a strange combination of relief and disbelief. You may realize that you have been holding your breath emotionally without even knowing it. You may discover a lightness that feels unfamiliar simply because you had forgotten what it was like not to be in constant defense. This is what can happen when you stop fighting the person you are becoming. And as that internal resistance begins to loosen, the next stage of this eclipse journey becomes ready to reveal itself. The fatigue weighing on you may have a deeper source than the circumstances you can point to, because carrying an identity that is smaller than your actual truth requires constant effort, constant self-editing, and constant suppression of what you already know inside. You may have become accustomed to holding yourself back so quietly that you stop noticing how much energy it takes to remain that way. But as soon as you stop fighting the truth that has been trying to emerge, something begins to loosen. The truth may frighten you. It may require you to leave behind relationships, routines, expectations, or identities that once felt essential to your survival. Yet even when that release is painful, there can be an immediate sense that something heavy is no longer sitting on your chest. This is the profound internal shift that many spiritual traditions describe through the language of rebirth. It is not merely an idea or a beautiful metaphor. It can be experienced physically, emotionally, and psychologically, as though you are meeting yourself again after years of living according to a version of yourself that was never completely authentic. Then you may begin noticing unusual patterns around you. Repeating numbers may catch your attention. A conversation may suddenly contain the exact idea you had been privately thinking about. An opportunity may appear at a moment so precise that it feels almost impossible to dismiss. These experiences can feel startling because they seem to mirror what has already been moving through your inner world. From a spiritual perspective, this is what alignment can feel like when resistance begins to fall away. The test itself is therefore not completed merely because the pressure disappears. The deeper completion comes through recognition, through that quiet but unmistakable realization that you are finally standing in a place that feels more truthful than the one you were trying so hard to maintain. Once the eclipse has finished moving through your life, circumstances that seemed permanently closed may begin shifting with surprising speed. After a long period in which nothing seemed to move, sudden momentum can feel almost overwhelming. This kind of dramatic contrast can follow major eclipse activations, with extended stagnation giving way to movement that arrives faster than your mind has time to process. You could encounter an opportunity you had stopped expecting. You could meet a person whose presence redirects the course of your life. You could finally reach certainty about a decision that has occupied your thoughts for months. Instead of solving the question through endless analysis, the answer may arrive as a calm, inner certainty, a feeling that settles deeply within you and does not need to keep arguing for its existence. That is part of the reward waiting beyond the test, and this is where you must be careful not to allow old fear to reject the very breakthrough you once asked for. People can spend years longing for change, asking for a new opening, praying for a different future, and then become frightened when that future actually appears, because unfamiliar freedom can feel less safe than familiar limitation. You may have become loyal to the smaller life simply because you learned how to survive inside it. Do not confuse familiarity with destiny. When new doors begin appearing, allow yourself to approach them. You may still feel uncertain. Your hands may metaphorically shake. A part of you may question whether you truly belong on the other side. But the existence of doubt does not mean the opportunity is wrong. You are allowed to move forward while still learning to believe in yourself. You have always been worthy of receiving good things. The significance of this eclipse is that what once required you to believe before seeing may now begin becoming visible through experience. There is an important distinction between endlessly pursuing a life and recognizing that a path is finally becoming available to you. For a long time, you may have felt as though you were pushing against invisible resistance, working harder, trying more intensely, chasing outcomes that repeatedly seemed to move just beyond your reach. That exhaustion should not automatically be interpreted as evidence that you were incapable. It may have reflected the fact that the path you wanted had not yet reached its necessary timing. Your effort was real, but timing matters too. Destiny does not organize itself according to your preferred schedule. It follows a cosmic schedule, and now that timing is catching up with desires you have carried privately for a long time. This is one of the strangest aspects of fate. What you wanted may not have been truly distant. It may have been waiting for the conditions that could make it accessible. It may also have required you to develop enough inner strength to hold it once it arrived. Receiving something larger than your previous capacity can be just as challenging as creating it, because a new relationship opportunity level of abundance or sense of purpose can expose every remaining fear you have about whether you are capable of sustaining it. The version of you able to carry that future is emerging now, shaped by everything this eclipse has already stirred inside you. What belongs to your path does not require you to destroy yourself through force. It requires readiness, and you may be closer to that readiness than you have ever been. Pay especially close attention to the days surrounding August 11th, because hesitation can become its own form of resistance during a period like this. This is not the time to immediately dismiss the intuition that has been growing inside you. It is not the time to bury a truth simply because acknowledging it would require a difficult decision. Whatever you have been quietly sensing, whatever persistent inner awareness has been pressing against the edges of your consciousness, deserves your attention now. The spiritual symbolism of a thin veil suggests that certain insights can become easier to perceive during this period, offering a kind of clarity that ordinary routines can easily drown out. Do not deliberately numb yourself through endless distraction. Do not automatically return to an old pattern simply because it feels predictable. Familiarity may provide temporary comfort, but the unknown is where the next chapter exists. You were never meant to remain outside your future forever. This moment carries both a warning and an invitation. Opportunities for profound inner recognition do not always present themselves with such intensity, and the way you respond during these coming days may influence how you move through the months ahead. Stay conscious. Stay emotionally present. Most importantly, remain truthful with yourself, even when that truth creates discomfort. The life beyond this eclipse is presented here as something worth the emotional work required to reach it. If you have remained with this message until this point, that itself can feel significant within the story being told, because the people who resonate most deeply with a message often recognize themselves in it and continue listening. The restlessness, the emotional pressure, the strange sensation that something beneath your life is moving. These experiences are being framed not as meaningless disruptions, but as preparation for the threshold represented by August 11th and the full unfolding of Eclipse Week. You are not approaching this moment as someone who has never faced difficulty. You are approaching it after surviving everything that once seemed capable of destroying you. Every disappointment, every period of uncertainty, every private battle, Every moment when you questioned whether you could continue has contributed to the person now standing at this threshold. You may still not completely believe that you are ready, but readiness does not always arrive as confidence. Sometimes it arrives as the willingness to take the next step despite uncertainty. The universe does not select people randomly for moments described as this significant. The message is that those who rise are the ones willing to believe in their own capacity before they have complete evidence. Let August 11th become the moment when you choose that belief. Let this eclipse represent a portal into a beginning rather than simply an ending. If you look back months from now, you may recognize this period as the point when the direction of your life began to change. And remember that awakening is not only an internal or spiritual process. It also reaches into practical areas of life, including the way you think about money, possibility, security, and abundance. The same process that asks you to release fear is also asking you to examine the scarcity mindset that may have quietly limited what you believe you can receive. This is why I want to remind you one final time about Train Your Brain to Make More Money. The audiobook designed to help you rewire your relationship with wealth so that when new opportunities become available, your mind is prepared to recognize and receive them, rather than allowing old money fears to pull you backward. You will find the link in the description below and pinned at the very top of the comments. Consider it as part of the practical side of this awakening, because the future you are moving toward requires not only spiritual openness, but also a mindset capable of supporting what you want to build. And if this message reached you at a moment when you needed these words, then within the spiritual framing of this journey, you can choose to see that timing as meaningful as well. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. And leave a comment sharing what you are releasing and what you are calling into your life as this eclipse moves through your experience. Because putting those intentions into words can become part of the awakening itself.